France was losing. Its cities were falling. Its people were starving. Armies were exhausted. And after years of war, the English appeared closer than ever to taking control of French kingdom. Then in middle of this chaos, something extraordinary happened. A teenage peasant girl appeared. She had no military education, no command in an army. She came from a small village in northeastern France, and yet she told the French leadership that she had been chosen to help save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. Within months, this unknown girl would stand beside the soldiers, enter battles, influence a future king, and became one of the most recognizable figures in the medieval history. But her story does not end with victory. She was captured, she was put on trial, and at only 19 years old, she was condemned to death. But who was Joan really? Was she a religious visionary, a brilliant military symbol, a political weapon, or simply a young woman caught in one of the bloodiest conflicts of medieval Europe? Tonight we go beyond the legend. This is the real story of Joan of Arc. To understand Joan, we first need to understand the world into which she was born. The year was approximately 1412. France and England had already been fighting for generations in what historians call the Hundred Years' War. The conflict was not a continuous war, lasting exactly 100 years. It was the series of wars, truces, political struggles, and renewed battles between the English and French crowns. And by John's childhood, France was in terrible condition. The French kingdom was divided. The English controlled large territories in North France. The powerful Duke of Burgundy had allied himself with the English, and the French royal succession was deeply disputed. The French king Charles VI suffered from the periods of severe mental illness. His condition created instability at the highest level of government. Meanwhile, rival factions fought for the control of France. On one side were Armagnacs, supporters of French royal family, and on the other were the Burgundians who were allied with England. France was not simply fighting a foreign enemy, it was fighting itself, and ordinary people paid the price. Villages were destroyed, fields were abandoned, trades was disrupted. Bandits and soldiers moved across the countryside. For peasants, war was not an abstract political argument. It meant hunger, fear, displacement, and death. And it was into this world that John was born, the girl from Domremy. John was born in the village of Domremy in northeastern France. Her family were peasants. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer and a village official. Her mother was Isabella Rome. John did not grow up in a royal palace. She did not receive the education of a noble woman. She was not trained from the childhood to become a soldier. She grew up in a rural community shaped by agriculture, religion, and war. As a young girl, Joan was deeply religious. Later, during her trial, she described hearing what she believed were divine voices. She associated these experiences with the saints and angels, According to Joan, the first important revelation came when she was around 13 years old. She said she heard a voice calling her to live a religious life. At first, the message was personal, but eventually she believed the voices had given her a much greater mission. She was told to help defend France, and most importantly, she was told to help bring the French heir to its rightful position. That heir was Charles, the future King Charles VII. But there was a problem. Joan was a teenage peasant girl. Why would anyone listen to her? John later said that she received the messages from the Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. We cannot know exactly what John experienced. History can document what she said. It cannot prove what caused those experiences. Some people throughout history have interpreted her vision as a divine. Others have proposed psychological or a medical explanation. But there is an important distinction. There is no historical evidence that allows us to confidently diagnose Joan from the distance. What we do know is that she genuinely believed her mission was sacred, and that belief transformed her life. She began telling people that France had a destiny to be restored. She believed Charles needed to be crowned, and she believed she had been sent to help make it happen. But believing something and convincing powerful people to act on it are two very different things. And Joan now had to leave her village. She eventually convinced local authorities to help her reach Robert de Baudricourt, a military commander at Vaucouleurs. At first, he did not take her seriously. Imagine the scene. A teenage peasant girl walks into a military stronghold and announces that she has been sent by the god to help save France. To the medieval commander, this could easily sound ridiculous, but John persisted. Eventually, she received an escort and traveled toward the court of Charles. The journey itself was dangerous. French territory was contested. Travelers could be attacked, yet Joan continued. She dressed in male clothing during much of her military journey and campaign. This later became an important issue during her trial. But for Joan, practical survival and military circumstances were central. She eventually reached Charles' court, and there something remarkable happened. Charles was not initially eager to place his future in the hands of a teenage peasant. According to the later accounts, Joan was subjected to questioning and examination. Her religious beliefs were investigated. Her character was scrutinized. The French leadership wanted to know whether she was a genuine or dangerous. Eventually, she gained enough trust to accompany the French army. But it is important to understand something. Joan was not simply handed command of the entire French military. Popular stories sometimes portray her as if she suddenly became the supreme general of France. The historical reality was more complicated. She became an extraordinary figure of influence and inspiration within the French war effort. Experienced commanders remained around her. Military decisions involved multiple people, but Joan's presence had something the French desperately needed: confidence. And her first major mission would be the one of the most important movement of her life. In 1428, English and Allied forces had laid siege to Orleans. The city was strategically important. If Orleans fell, the position of French monarchy could become even more dangerous. The French desperately needed a victory. Then John arrived. She was still a teenager, but the effect of her arrival was extraordinary. She encouraged soldiers. She carried a banner. She urged the French forces to act. Her banner became one of the most famous symbols associated with her. Joan herself was not simply a fighter. She repeatedly emphasized her religious mission. She wanted the French to believe victory was possible, and the siege changed dramatically. French forces launched attacks against English positions. Joan participated in fighting and was wounded by an arrow. But she returned to the battlefield. Her courage became legendary, and within days the French began breaking the English siege. On May 8, 1429, the English forces withdrew from Orleans. The victory transformed Joan's reputation. A teenage peasant had arrived at a desperate moment, and now people believed she might actually be the person she claimed to be. But Joan believed Orleans was only the beginning. Her larger objective was to get Charles crowned king. The tradition coronation city was Reims. The journey was dangerous. French forces needed to capture or secure territory along the route. But after the success of Orleans, momentum shifted towards French. Joan continued to push for action. French army advanced and eventually Charles entered Reims. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII. For Joan, this was a moment of enormous significance. She had fulfilled one of the central part of mission she believed she had received. The peasant girl from the Domremy had helped lead France toward one of the most important political ceremonies. But her greatest victories were already behind her, and her enemies were preparing to capturing her. After Charles' coronation, Joan continued to fight, but the political situation became more complicated. Military momentum slowed, diplomatic possibilities emerged. The French court did not always follow Joan's preferred strategy. Eventually, she was involved in failed attempt to retake Paris. The French forces withdrew. The Joan's position became increasingly uncertain. She was still celebrated by many people, but she no longer had the unstoppable momentum of Orleans campaign. And then came the moment that changed everything. On May 23, 1430, Joan was captured during the fighting near Compiègne. She had been fighting against Burgundian forces. The Burgundians were allied with English. Joan was taken prisoner, and now her enemies had something extremely valuable. Not a soldier, not a prisoner, a symbol. Joan had become a powerful symbol of French resistance. If English and allies could destroy her reputation, they could weaken the belief surrounding the French cause. Joan was eventually transferred to the English custody, and then came the trial. The trial began in 1431 in Rouen. The proceedings were religious in form. The judges questioned her about her vision, her clothing, her behavior, and her religious beliefs. But the political background was impossible to ignore. Her enemies wanted to discredit her. If they could establish what she was a heretic, then her victories could be presented not as a divine or a legitimate, but as evidence of the religious corruption. John was questioned repeatedly, and a surviving trial record gave us one of the most remarkable windows into her personality. She could be bold, she could be sarcastic, she could be cautious, and sometimes she gave extremely clever answers. One famous line from the trial concerned the question of whether she believed she was in a God's grace. The question was designed as a trap. If she said yes, the judges could accuse her. and accuse her of presumptions. If she said no, they could use it against her. She answered in a way that avoided the trap. Her trial revealed something important. She was not simply a passive victim. She understood that words could be weapons. One of the most important issues in Joan's trial involved her clothing. She wore male clothing. The judges treated this as a religious and a moral issue. But there was also a practical reason. She had been traveling with soldiers. She lived in a military camps, and male clothing could provide greater physical protection. She also associated her clothing with her religious mission. Eventually, the issue became central to the case against her. The trial was complicated, controversial, and heavily political. John was condemned for heresy. But then something unexpected happened. She was given a chance to recant. And exhausted and frightened, she temporarily signed a document renouncing aspect of her previous behavior. She was sentenced to imprisonment, but her story was not over. John soon returned to wearing male clothing. The exact circumstances remain debated, but her judges treated this as a violation of her submission. The legal case against her was reopened. She was declared a relapsed heretic, and now there would be no second chance. John was condemned to death, and she was only about 19 years old. On May 30, 1431, she was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. She was executed by burning. She was approximately 19 years old, a girl who had entered the history as a peasant from the Domremy was gone. But her story had only begun to become legendary. Her ashes were scattered into the Seine. The English and their allies had killed Joan, but they could not kill the meaning that people attached to her, and that would become their greatest mistake. Years later, the political situation changed. Charles VII's position became stronger. France gradually recovered from territory, and Joan's reputation changed dramatically. In 1456, her retrial concluded that Joan had been wrongfully condemned. Her conviction was overturned. The earlier trial was declared unjust. Centuries later, the Catholic Church recognized the Joan as a saint. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Pope Benedict XV. The teenage girl who had been condemned as a heretic had become a saint. This is where history becomes especially fascinating because there are several Johns. There is a John of medieval religious history, French nationalism, military legend, Catholic tradition, and the John of modern popular culture. But behind all these versions was a real young woman. She was born to a poor rural family. She lived through the war. She believed she had a divine mission. She convinced powerful people to listen to her. She entered a military world dominated by men. She survived a battlefield wound. She helped inspire a remarkable French victory. She witnessed the coronation of king. She was captured. She faced an intensely hostile trial, and she had died before reaching adulthood. Perhaps the greatest mystery remains the simplest one. What did Joan actually hear? She believed her voices came from heaven. Some suggest neurological or psychological explanations. Others believed her religious experiences should be understood within the culture and spirituality. Her death did not end her influence, instead, it amplified it. Artists painted her, writers transformed her into the literature, politicians invoked her, religious leaders celebrated her. and French nationalists adopted her. More than 5 centuries later, people still know her name. Her story reminds us that history is not always changed by the kings, generals, and wealthy nobles. Sometimes history turns because one unexpected person appeared at exactly the right moment. She did not know that centuries later people would still debate her vision, her military role, and her legacy. Joan of Arc remains one of the history's most extraordinary figure, not because she lived life, but because in a few short years she became impossible to forget. The girl who became a warrior, the prisoner who became a saint, and the legend history could not erase. If you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe for more stories of the people, mysteries, battles, and forgotten lives that shaped our world.